The turn of the 18th century marked a pivotal moment in human history, a threshold between the world of the early modern period and the transformations that would eventually produce industrial civilization as we know it today. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, societies were changing in profound and interconnected ways, reshaping political boundaries, economic systems, religious practices, social hierarchies, and daily life for hundreds of millions of people scattered across the globe. Wars of unprecedented scale ravaged entire continents, leaving landscapes scarred and populations decimated. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust while new powers rose to take their place. Populations migrated across vast distances, sometimes voluntarily in search of opportunity and sometimes forced by conquest, enslavement, or economic desperation. New ideas challenged ancient certainties, shaking the foundations of belief systems that had organized human life for generations. To observers living through these tumultuous decades, the world must have seemed to be remaking itself before their very eyes, old orders crumbling in chaos while new ones struggled to emerge from the wreckage. The sense of living through unprecedented change pervaded the writings of the era, from the private diaries of ordinary people to the elaborate treatises of philosophers attempting to make sense of a world in flux. In recent years, a theory has gained considerable traction in certain online communities suggesting that these dramatic changes were not the result of natural historical processes but evidence of a deliberate reset, a coordinated erasure of the previous civilization and the imposition of a new historical narrative by shadowy forces seeking to control humanity and suppress knowledge of what came before. According to this theory, sometime around 1700, possibly through catastrophe or conquest or some combination of both, the advanced civilization of Tartaria was destroyed and its memory systematically suppressed, leaving only scattered traces in mysterious architecture, unexplained technology, and troubling inconsistencies in the historical record that mainstream scholars refuse to address. But when examined against the vast body of evidence preserved in archives, archaeological sites, continuous institutional records, and the material culture that survives from this period, this theory dissolves into nothing more substantial than the shadows it invokes. The changes that occurred around 1700 were real and dramatic beyond question, but they were the products of forces that historians have studied and documented for centuries through painstaking research. There was no reset orchestrated by hidden powers. There was only history, in all its complexity, violence, contingency, and human tragedy. The concept of a historical reset around 1700 typically combines several distinct claims into a single sweeping narrative of suppression and concealment that appeals to those who distrust mainstream institutions. Proponents argue that the official historical record of the 17th and early 18th centuries is largely fabricated or heavily distorted to hide the truth about what really happened. They claim that evidence of advanced pre-reset civilization has been systematically destroyed or hidden by authorities who fear what its discovery would mean for their power. And they assert that the institutions responsible for maintaining historical knowledge, including universities, museums, archives, and governments, are complicit in perpetuating elaborate lies about the past that serve the interests of shadowy elites. These claims are often supported by pointing to apparent anomalies or inconsistencies in the historical record, gaps in documentation that seem suspicious, sudden changes in architectural style that appear inexplicable, or technological achievements that seem far too advanced for their supposed era. But each of these supposed anomalies can be explained through conventional historical analysis without recourse to conspiracy theories that require impossible levels of coordination and secrecy. The real history of the period around 1700 is complex enough to account for any apparent inconsistencies, and far more interesting than the fantasy of a coordinated reset designed to enslave humanity through ignorance of its true past. The political landscape of Europe in the decades around 1700 was dominated by warfare on a scale that contemporaries found unprecedented and deeply devastating to the fabric of society. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, involved virtually every major European power in a desperate struggle over whether the Bourbon or Habsburg dynasty would control the Spanish throne and its vast colonial empire stretching from the Philippines to Peru. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands marched across the continent, living off the land and leaving devastation in their wake as they fought battles that left tens of thousands dead in single days of carnage. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704, the Battle of Ramillies in 1706, the Battle of Malplaquet in 1709, each of these engagements produced casualties on a scale that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to the violence of their age. The financial strain of maintaining these massive armies transformed state institutions throughout Europe, expanding bureaucracies to collect taxes, developing new methods of public debt and credit that would shape economic governance for centuries, and concentrating power in the hands of monarchs who could mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war in 1713, redrew the map of Europe in fundamental ways and established a new balance of power that would persist with modifications until the upheavals of the French Revolution nearly a century later. These events are documented in extraordinary detail through diplomatic correspondence preserved in state archives, military records maintained by armies and governments, personal memoirs written by participants and observers, newspaper accounts that spread information across borders, and the physical traces left by armies on the landscape itself. There is no gap in the record that would suggest a reset, no missing years or inexplicable silences. There is only the continuous flow of events recorded by thousands of witnesses writing in dozens of languages across multiple nations with competing interests and perspectives. The Great Northern War, fought between Sweden and a coalition of rivals from 1700 to 1721, similarly transformed the political geography of Northern and Eastern Europe in ways that contemporaries extensively documented. Sweden, which had been the dominant military power in the Baltic region for the better part of a century, was decisively defeated by a coalition led by Russia, Poland-Saxony, and Denmark-Norway. The war reduced Sweden from the status of a great power to that of a second-rank nation, while Russia under Peter the Great emerged as a major European force that would play an increasingly important role in continental affairs. Peter's reforms, which sought to modernize Russian military, administrative, educational, and cultural institutions along Western European lines, involved tremendous disruption to traditional Russian society, displacing established elites, importing foreign experts, and demanding sacrifices from a population already burdened by the costs of continuous warfare. The founding of St. Petersburg in 1703 on swampy land conquered from Sweden symbolized Peter's ambitions in their most dramatic form, creating an entirely new capital city oriented toward Europe rather than the old Russia of Moscow and the Orthodox Church. Thousands of workers died constructing this city in a hostile environment, their sacrifices commemorated in the very stones of the buildings they raised. These changes were dramatic and sometimes brutally violent, but they were the result of specific political decisions by identifiable historical actors pursuing their own interests and ambitions, not evidence of a mysterious reset imposed by unknown forces from outside the historical process. Economic transformations during this period were equally significant and far-reaching, as new patterns of trade and production reshaped the material basis of European and global society in ways that would have consequences extending to the present day. The Atlantic economy, based on the infamous triangular trade connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas, reached its full and terrible development in the early 18th century. European manufactured goods, particularly textiles, metal products, and firearms, were exchanged in Africa for enslaved human beings, who were transported across the Atlantic in conditions of almost unimaginable horror to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, and other commodities for European markets. The ships returned to Europe laden with these products, completing a circuit of exploitation that generated enormous wealth for European merchants, plantation owners, and the states that protected and taxed this commerce, while inflicting incalculable suffering on millions of African people torn from their homes and families. The economic records of this trade survive in extraordinary and damning detail, from the meticulous account books of trading companies that recorded every transaction to the logbooks of slave ships that documented conditions during the Middle Passage to the plantation records that tracked the lives, labor, and deaths of enslaved workers with the same attention given to livestock and equipment. These records provide no evidence of a reset that would have disrupted this commerce. They provide evidence of human greed, cruelty, and the systematic exploitation of some human beings by others for profit, exploitation that continued without interruption across the supposed period of reset and beyond. The colonization of the Americas continued to reshape societies on both sides of the Atlantic during this period, extending and deepening processes that had begun more than 2 centuries earlier with the first voyages of Columbus. Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch colonies expanded into new territories, displacing or subjugating indigenous populations through a combination of warfare, disease, and the relentless pressure of settler expansion. Enslaved African labor was imported in ever-increasing numbers to work the mines that produced silver and gold and the plantations that produced the sugar and tobacco that European markets demanded. The demographic catastrophe that had befallen indigenous American populations following European contact continued to reverberate across the continents, as diseases, warfare, forced labor, and the disruption of traditional ways of life reduced populations that had once numbered in the tens of millions to mere fractions of their former size. These tragic events are documented not only in European sources written by colonizers and administrators but in indigenous records, oral traditions that have been preserved and transmitted across generations, and the archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements and disrupted societies that can still be read in the landscape. The transformation of the Americas was the result of colonization and its terrible consequences, the working out of processes set in motion by decisions made by identifiable historical actors, not a mysterious reset that erased a previous civilization in order to start history over with a clean slate. Religious change during this period reflected both the continuing aftermath of the Protestant Reformation that had divided Western Christianity in the 16th century and new intellectual currents that would eventually produce the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had established the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories, ending the era of devastating religious wars that had torn Europe apart but leaving the continent permanently divided between Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and other Christian communities that viewed each other with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. In the decades around 1700, new movements emerged within both Protestantism and Catholicism, including Pietism in Germany and Jansenism in France, emphasizing personal piety, emotional religious experience, and spiritual renewal against what their adherents saw as the cold formalism and moral corruption of established churches more concerned with wealth and power than with the salvation of souls. At the same time, the intellectual movement that would become known as the Enlightenment was beginning to take shape in the salons and coffee houses of Paris, London, Amsterdam, and other centers of learning, as philosophers and scientists proposed new ways of understanding nature and society based on reason, observation, and evidence rather than tradition, revelation, and authority. These religious and intellectual changes are thoroughly documented in printed books that circulated across Europe in editions that can still be examined in libraries, in personal correspondence preserved in archives, in the records of religious institutions and universities, and in the architectural and artistic productions of the period that embodied changing sensibilities in stone, paint, and music. They represent continuous developments within European culture responding to new challenges and opportunities, not evidence of a discontinuity imposed by external forces seeking to hide the truth about human history. The scientific revolution that had transformed European understanding of nature during the 17th century continued to produce new discoveries and practical applications in the early 18th century, building on foundations laid by earlier generations of investigators. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, established the mathematical framework for understanding motion and gravitation that would dominate physics for more than 2 centuries and that still provides the basis for most practical calculations in engineering and astronomy. Newton's work did not appear in isolation but built on generations of previous scientific inquiry, from the astronomical observations of Copernicus and the careful measurements of Tycho Brahe through the mathematical laws of planetary motion discovered by Kepler and the mechanical philosophy developed by Descartes and his followers. Each step in this progression is documented in printed works that survive in libraries around the world, in the correspondence of scientists preserved in archives, and in the instruments and apparatus that researchers constructed to conduct their investigations. The Royal Society of London and the French Academy of Sciences provided institutional homes for the collaborative pursuit of natural knowledge, publishing journals and correspondence that document the development of scientific ideas in meticulous detail, recording debates, experiments, and discoveries as they occurred. Claims that pre-reset civilization possessed advanced technology that has been suppressed by modern authorities must ignore this continuous record of scientific development, which shows clearly and unambiguously how modern science emerged through incremental discoveries building on previous work rather than through sudden revelations or recoveries of lost knowledge from vanished civilizations. The demographic history of the period around 1700 provides particularly strong and detailed evidence against reset theories, as population records show continuous trends rather than the sudden catastrophic discontinuities that would be expected from a civilization-destroying event. European populations were growing slowly after the devastations of the 17th century, which had included the horrific 30 Years' War that killed perhaps a third of the German population, recurring outbreaks of plague that swept through cities and towns with terrible mortality, and agricultural crises caused by climatic fluctuations that resulted in widespread famine and suffering. Parish registers, which recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials in local churches across Europe, provide extraordinarily detailed information about population trends at the local level, allowing researchers to reconstruct the demographic history of individual communities across centuries. Census records and tax registers offer broader perspectives on regional and national populations, showing how numbers changed over time in response to economic conditions, warfare, and disease. These records show no evidence of the massive, sudden population loss that would be expected from a catastrophic reset that destroyed an entire civilization. They show instead the normal patterns of demographic change that historians have documented across many societies and periods, with populations rising and falling in response to the ordinary factors of war, disease, famine, and economic opportunity. The people who lived through the early 18th century were the children and grandchildren of those who had lived through the 17th, connected by unbroken chains of documented descent that can be traced through the patient work of genealogists working with surviving records. Architectural changes during the period around 1700 are often cited by reset theorists as evidence of discontinuity, with claims that buildings in certain styles could not possibly have been constructed using the technology supposedly available at the time and must therefore be remnants of a lost advanced civilization. These claims typically rest on fundamental misunderstandings of historical construction techniques and the organization of labor in pre-industrial societies, misunderstandings that are easily corrected by examining the abundant evidence of how buildings were actually designed and constructed. The great buildings of the early 18th century, from the magnificent Palace of Versailles that Louis XIV constructed as a monument to his own glory to the elegant Baroque churches that Fischer von Erlach designed in Vienna and Wren rebuilt in London after the Great Fire, were constructed using techniques that had been developed over centuries and were thoroughly documented in architectural treatises, construction contracts, account books, and the correspondence of architects with their patrons. The skilled workers who built these structures were organized in guilds that maintained and transmitted craft knowledge across generations through formal systems of apprenticeship and journeyman training, ensuring that the skills needed to work stone, timber, and metal were preserved and refined over time. Young apprentices learned their trades by working alongside experienced masters, gradually acquiring the knowledge and judgment that would allow them to take on increasingly complex tasks until they could themselves train the next generation. There is no mystery about how these buildings were constructed that requires appeal to lost civilizations or suppressed technology. There is only the impressive but entirely explicable achievement of organized human labor working with available materials and accumulated knowledge passed down through institutional structures designed precisely for that purpose. The claim that history was deliberately falsified around 1700 faces an absolutely insurmountable problem in the form of the documentary record itself, which survives in quantities and varieties that no conspiracy could plausibly have fabricated or systematically altered. Historical documents from this period survive in enormous quantities across hundreds of repositories in dozens of countries, far exceeding what any conspiracy could possibly have produced from whole cloth. The archives of European states contain millions of documents relating to governance, diplomacy, warfare, taxation, and administration during this period, written by thousands of different officials pursuing their ordinary bureaucratic duties. Church records preserve information about the religious lives of ordinary people across thousands of parishes, documenting baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the countless small transactions of everyday spiritual life. Legal records document disputes over property, inheritance, contracts, and criminal offenses, preserving the voices of ordinary people as they sought justice through established institutional channels. Personal correspondence and diaries reveal the thoughts, experiences, emotions, and daily concerns of individuals from all levels of society, from monarchs and ministers to merchants and craftsmen to farmers and laborers. These documents were produced by thousands of different writers in dozens of languages, preserved in hundreds of different institutions with their own histories and interests, and studied by scholars from many countries over the course of 3 centuries. The idea that all of this vast documentary heritage could have been fabricated or systematically falsified in a coordinated way defies basic logic and everything we know about how human institutions actually function. The effort required would have been impossible to coordinate across political boundaries, linguistic barriers, and institutional rivalries. The results would have been exposed long ago by scholars who had every incentive to make their professional reputations by revealing fraud and challenging established narratives. The continuity of institutions across the supposed reset period provides additional compelling evidence against the theory. Universities founded in the medieval period, including Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Bologna, and many others, continued to operate through the 17th and 18th centuries without interruption, their records showing continuous enrollment of students, succession of faculty members, conferment of degrees, and evolution of curricula in response to changing intellectual interests. Religious orders maintained unbroken histories of membership and governance, with each generation of monks, friars, and nuns recorded in chapter books and necrology rolls that document the continuous life of these communities across centuries. Noble families traced their genealogies across the supposed reset period without any interruption or gap, their rights to lands and titles depending on their ability to demonstrate legitimate descent from ancestors whose existence was documented in surviving records. Commercial enterprises passed from generation to generation through inheritance and partnership, their account books showing continuous operation across the period when a reset supposedly destroyed the previous civilization. These institutional continuities, documented in millions of records that can be examined by any researcher with the language skills and archival access to do so, are fundamentally incompatible with the catastrophic discontinuity that reset theories require. They show instead the normal persistence of human organizations across time, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential structures, purposes, and identities. The geographical knowledge of the period around 1700 demonstrates continuous development through exploration and surveying rather than sudden revelation or loss of previously known information. Mapmakers of the early 18th century built consciously and explicitly on the cartographic traditions of previous centuries, citing their sources and acknowledging their debts to earlier scholars while gradually improving the accuracy of their representations as new surveys were conducted and new information became available from explorers, merchants, and missionaries returning from distant regions. The famous maps of Guillaume Delisle in France and Herman Moll in England represented the best available geographical knowledge of their time, showing areas of relative certainty based on direct observation alongside regions of uncertainty and speculation where information was sparse or unreliable. These maps clearly acknowledge through their design and notation what was known with confidence and what remained unknown or contested, providing no evidence whatsoever that mapmakers were concealing information about previous civilizations that they secretly knew to have existed. The progression from less accurate to more accurate maps across the 17th and 18th centuries, a progression that can be traced through surviving examples in map collections around the world, reflects the gradual accumulation of knowledge through exploration and systematic surveying, not the sudden revelation of previously suppressed information or the deliberate concealment of geographical truths. The material culture of the period, preserved in museums and archaeological sites around the world, confirms the picture provided by documentary sources through an entirely independent category of evidence. Artifacts from the late 17th and early 18th centuries show continuous development of styles and technologies, not sudden breaks, unexplained advances, or the mysterious appearance of objects that could not have been produced with available methods. Furniture, ceramics, textiles, metalwork, glass, and countless other categories of objects all display characteristics that can be traced to earlier traditions through the patient work of art historians and archaeologists while simultaneously showing the innovations and developments that would influence later production. Archaeological excavations of sites occupied during this period reveal layers of continuous habitation, with artifacts and structures that fit precisely the documented historical record in their forms, materials, and methods of production. The physical evidence independently corroborates the written sources, providing confirmation from an entirely separate category of data that the history recorded in documents corresponds to actual events and conditions in the material world that people inhabited. The global perspective on the period around 1700 reveals dramatic changes occurring across multiple civilizations simultaneously, all documented in their own independent historical traditions maintained by scribes and scholars who knew nothing of each other's work. In China, the Qing dynasty was consolidating its control after the dramatic conquest of the Ming dynasty in 1644, a conquest accomplished by Manchu invaders from the northeast who established a new ruling house while largely preserving Chinese administrative traditions. The Qing expanded their territory to include Tibet, Mongolia, Taiwan, and vast regions of Central Asia while developing distinctive forms of governance that combined Manchu military organization with Chinese bureaucratic methods. In India, the Mughal Empire that had dominated the subcontinent for 2 centuries was beginning its long and painful decline, weakened by succession conflicts among princes, the emergence of powerful regional governors who ruled their territories as virtual independent states, and the growing presence of European trading companies that would eventually become territorial powers in their own right. In the Ottoman Empire, which controlled vast territories from the Balkans through Anatolia to Arabia and North Africa, military defeats at the hands of European and Persian rivals and persistent economic challenges were prompting reform efforts intended to restore the empire's competitive position through modernization of military technology and administrative methods. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained its policy of relative isolation from European influence while presiding over a period of remarkable economic growth, urban development, and cultural flourishing that produced distinctive artistic and literary achievements. Each of these civilizations maintained its own historical records in its own languages and scripts, preserved by its own institutions according to its own traditions, documenting events that are consistent with the records of other civilizations where they describe shared events or interconnected processes. The idea that history was globally reset around 1700 would require all of these entirely independent traditions to have been falsified in precisely coordinated ways by conspirators who somehow overcame the profound political, cultural, linguistic, and religious divisions that separated these societies and that often brought them into violent conflict with one another. This level of global coordination among bitter rivals is not merely implausible. It is absolutely impossible given everything we know about how human institutions and international relations actually function. The intellectual changes that occurred in European thought during this period are particularly important for understanding why reset theories have emerged in the present and why they appeal to certain audiences despite their total lack of supporting evidence. The Enlightenment, which took definitive shape during the early and middle decades of the 18th century, championed the power of human reason and empirical evidence against the claims of tradition, inherited authority, and religious revelation. Enlightenment thinkers were often sharply critical of established institutions, including churches that demanded unquestioning faith and monarchies that claimed divine sanction for their power. They developed historical methods intended to distinguish documented truth from legend and fabrication, subjecting traditional narratives to critical scrutiny and demanding evidence for claims that had previously been accepted on the authority of ancient texts or venerable institutions. These critical methods, refined and improved over subsequent centuries by generations of scholars, are precisely the tools that modern historians use to evaluate claims about the past, including the extraordinary claims made by reset theorists. Reset theories represent in many ways a rejection of Enlightenment epistemology, a return to the pre-Enlightenment world where authority and tradition could override evidence and critical analysis, where secret knowledge held by initiated elites trumped the publicly accessible findings of scholarly research. Understanding this intellectual context helps explain why reset theories appeal to those who distrust mainstream institutions and expertise, even as it confirms precisely why those theories cannot withstand the scrutiny of scholars trained in methods designed specifically to detect fraud and fabrication. The psychological appeal of reset theories lies partly in their ability to provide simple, comprehensible explanations for complex historical changes that can otherwise seem bewildering in their multiplicity and interconnection. The world of 1700 was genuinely and dramatically different from the world of 1600, and the pace of change accelerated continuously as the 18th century progressed toward the even more dramatic transformations of the industrial and democratic revolutions. For those unfamiliar with the detailed evidence of how these changes actually occurred through countless individual decisions and events, the temptation to explain them through a single dramatic intervention is entirely understandable at a psychological level. A reset provides narrative satisfaction, a clear before and after that makes sense of otherwise bewildering complexity in the same way that a novel or film provides narrative structure to the chaos of lived experience. But this satisfaction comes at a tremendous cost in accuracy and understanding. The real explanation for historical change is not a single reset imposed by hidden powers but the accumulation of countless individual decisions, events, and processes, each contributing in its own way to transformations that no single actor fully controlled or predicted. This explanation is considerably less satisfying as narrative but far more faithful to the evidence and far more useful for understanding how change actually happens in human societies. The communities that promote reset theories often point to what they perceive as contradictions or improbabilities in the historical record, arguing that mainstream historians have failed to explain certain phenomena adequately and that these failures point to deliberate concealment. In some cases, these perceived anomalies result from simple misunderstandings of historical context or technology by people who lack specialized knowledge of how things were done in earlier periods. In other cases, they reflect genuine gaps in the historical record, areas where evidence happens to be sparse or ambiguous and where historians honestly acknowledge uncertainty about what happened. But uncertainty is not evidence of conspiracy. Every historical period contains gaps and puzzles that resist easy explanation despite the best efforts of researchers, and honest historians acknowledge these limitations rather than claiming to possess complete and certain knowledge of everything that occurred. The appropriate response to uncertainty is continued research and cautious interpretation that respects the limits of available evidence, not the construction of elaborate theories that explain gaps by positing vast conspiracies of suppression that themselves lack any documentary support whatsoever. The conspiracy required by reset theories would have to encompass not only historians but archaeologists, archivists, librarians, museum curators, genealogists, art historians, and countless other professionals who work with evidence of the past in their daily activities. It would require perfect coordination across national boundaries that have often been hostile, across political systems ranging from democracies to authoritarian regimes with completely opposed ideological commitments, and across the profound divisions of language, culture, and religion that separate human societies. It would require maintaining perfect secrecy across centuries despite the constant turnover of personnel in every institution and the competitive pressures that give ambitious individuals strong incentives to reveal fraud if they discovered it and thereby make their careers. No known conspiracy in all of human history has ever achieved anything remotely approaching this level of scope, coordination, duration, and perfect secrecy. The conspiracies that have actually been exposed by historians and investigators were typically limited in scope to particular organizations or projects, short-lived before they were discovered or fell apart from internal contradictions, and ultimately revealed through the determined efforts of investigators following evidence wherever it led. The reset conspiracy, by contrast, would have to be essentially unlimited in geographical and institutional scope, centuries in duration across countless generations of participants, and completely invisible to all investigation by researchers with every incentive and considerable resources to expose it. This is not a plausible historical claim that deserves serious consideration. It is a fantasy that reveals far more about the anxieties and epistemological confusions of its believers than about anything that actually happened in the past. The study of historical change around 1700 offers genuine and valuable insights into processes that remain directly relevant to understanding the contemporary world and its challenges. The emergence of new forms of state power capable of mobilizing resources and populations on unprecedented scales, the development of global economic networks connecting producers and consumers across oceans and continents, the transformation of religious authority in the face of new intellectual challenges, and the beginnings of modern scientific culture that would eventually reshape every aspect of human life, all of these developments have roots in this crucial transitional period. Understanding how these changes occurred, through the complex interactions of political ambition, economic interest, intellectual innovation, technological development, and the countless contingent events that deflected history in unexpected directions, provides analytical tools for understanding similar processes in the contemporary world where equally dramatic transformations are reshaping societies. This understanding is valuable not because it confirms comfortable existing beliefs but precisely because it challenges simple narratives and reveals the genuine complexity of human affairs in all their unpredictable multiplicity. The reset theory, by contrast, offers no such understanding. It replaces genuine complexity with a simplistic fantasy of hidden agency, attributing historical change to mysterious conspirators rather than to the countless identifiable individuals and groups whose documented actions actually shaped events. The documentary heritage of the period around 1700 survives in archives and libraries that are increasingly accessible to public examination through digitization projects that have transformed historical research. Millions of historical documents are now available online, allowing anyone with internet access and the necessary language skills to examine primary sources that were previously accessible only to professional scholars who could travel to the specific repositories where they were held. This democratization of access has tremendous potential for expanding public engagement with historical evidence and enabling citizens to evaluate claims about the past for themselves rather than relying solely on the interpretations of experts. But this same accessibility also creates opportunities for misinterpretation by those who encounter documents without the contextual knowledge necessary for accurate understanding of what they are seeing. A manuscript page that looks mysterious and significant to an untrained viewer may be perfectly routine to a paleographer who can read the handwriting and understands the conventions of the period. Closing the gap between accessibility and accurate readability requires not restricting access to documents but expanding education about how to read historical sources correctly, including understanding of the languages, scripts, conventions, and contexts that shaped their production. The period around 1700 witnessed transformations that genuinely reshaped the world in fundamental ways, establishing patterns and processes that would dominate subsequent centuries and that continue to influence the present in which we live. These changes were sometimes violent and frequently painful, displacing entire populations, destroying traditional ways of life that had persisted for generations, and creating new forms of inequality, exploitation, and suffering on scales that earlier periods had never witnessed. Understanding these changes requires careful attention to surviving evidence, respect for the genuine complexity of historical causation, and willingness to revise interpretations in light of new discoveries and perspectives. It does not require conspiracy theories that posit hidden agencies manipulating events from behind the scenes while somehow leaving no trace of their existence in the abundant documentary record. The forces that shaped the early 18th century were visible to contemporaries who described them in their documents, analyzed by scholars who have studied those documents for 3 centuries, and accessible to any modern researcher willing to do the painstaking work of historical investigation. The reset never happened because it did not need to happen. The real, documented forces of historical change, operating through identifiable human actors and institutions, were entirely sufficient to produce all the transformations that reset theorists attribute to mysterious interventions by unnamed powers. Understanding these real forces is the work of genuine historical scholarship. Inventing imaginary forces to replace them is the work of fantasy masquerading as research. The world of 1700 was connected to both its past and its future through continuous chains of human experience, institutional development, and material culture that can be traced and documented with considerable precision. The people who lived through this period knew their parents and grandparents, remembered events from their own childhoods and youth, and anticipated futures that their children and grandchildren would inhabit after they themselves were gone. Their lives were embedded in communities with documented history stretching back generations and forward to the present day through unbroken succession. The documents they left behind, the buildings they constructed, the objects they made and used in their daily lives, all survive as tangible evidence of their existence and their connection to the broader continuous flow of human history. This evidence is abundant, consistent across multiple independent sources, and available for examination by anyone willing to develop the skills necessary to interpret it accurately. It tells a story of continuous change driven by identifiable causes, not catastrophic reset imposed by unknown powers. It tells the story of history as it actually happened, complex and sometimes confusing, often tragic and occasionally inspiring, but always human, always comprehensible through patient study and careful interpretation. The reset of 1700 never happened because history continued without interruption, carried forward by the billions of individual lives and countless human institutions that together constitute the continuous fabric of the human past.